July 3rd, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the big, beautiful bill that is set to Donald Trump's desk this evening as the Republican Party this morning passed, or actually this afternoon, passed the big, beautiful bill, a huge decision that will likely come at a cost, not just for the millions upon millions of Americans that will be affected by this very key piece of legislation for Donald Trump's second administration, but also electorally for the Republican Party as America braces to feel the real impact of this historic, in a way, legislation that passed in a very narrow fashion across the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. The big, beautiful bill being extremely unpopular is largely because of the way that Democrats have been messaging around it, and largely winning the messaging war. The American public largely disapproves of the one big, beautiful bill, a very big, for no pun intended, very big reaction in a negative way for the GOP as they steamrolled this legislation through late-night efforts and long, grueling hours between Democrats and Republicans, and a lot of negotiation on the GOP side as the overwhelming majority in some of these polls of the American public disapproves of the act entirely. And even in the worst case, you're finding that this averaging around here does show that the American public largely does know what this bill is, or at least has an idea of what they believe it is, and are just disapproving of what the Republican Party is doing. And they don't like it because they largely see it as something that cuts Medicaid. They see it as something that really does make a big impact on the American public. And the way that Democrats, again, have been messaging on it is something that really makes the Republican Party seem extremely out of touch. What you're seeing is that the Democrats are using a lot of oppositional language, trying to say that the one big beautiful bill deals with budget cuts and deals with Medicaid cuts and deals with a lot of different things that negatively impact average Americans, but benefit the wealthiest among us. And so whether or not you agree with the way that Democrats have been messaging on the one big beautiful bill, they have been doing so in a way that is absolutely effective, and you find it to be true in the public's perception of the bill. Because the Donald Trump administration has been really trying to brand this bill as good for the working class. But Americans aren't taking the bait. They're seeing this for what many people see as a negative bill, one that does continue tax cuts that benefit wealthier Americans. That's true. You can find that in the provisions, as well as the fact that all of these different age changes in terms of who qualifies for different government assistance, a crackdown in terms of employment for those who already qualify for government assistance. These are not things that voters take lightly, because a huge chunk of this country does in fact rely on assistance from the United States government, whether they are a senior, whether they are disabled, for a variety of different reasons. You're finding that this legislation does impact the most vulnerable Americans, and people obviously don't like that. Now, the one big beautiful bill obviously has not been implemented yet, so there will be effects that will be felt later down the line that will likely inform the decision around Americans who are asked this question before passage: how do you feel about Donald Trump's keynote piece of legislation? Because for all most people know, it is something they hear about in the news, it is something they are getting messaged to by Democrats and Republicans, but it's not something they could feel the direct impact of just yet. But when Donald Trump signs this law, there will be an immediate set of backlash, potentially even by some Republican voters. And it reminds me a lot of the 2010 midterm elections that came in at a time that Republicans did quite well. A big reason for it, Obamacare. Now, I was looking around just to see, how did people feel about Obamacare in the past? Was there a feeling about it that feels similar to how voters see the one big beautiful bill that could have led to such a catastrophic loss in 2010? And the answer is absolutely. Polling isn't new, and Pew Research published this on October 25th, 2010. And they asked, amongst, these possible GOP agenda issues in the 2012 presidential election, it was 2 years early, granted, but they asked voters, how do you feel about Republican agenda issues? On one of them, they say, how do you feel about repealing the healthcare legislation enacted this year? It took a while for this to be coined Obamacare. It took a while for it to be talked about as the ACA or the Affordable Care Act. So it was called the healthcare legislation enacted this year. It was largely the big, beautiful bill in a way for Democrats, as they had a huge overhaul of, government intervention in healthcare in a way that was seen now today as positive for Americans. But at the time, voters didn't like it. 49% of all voters said that they approved of repealing the healthcare legislation. Around 39% disapproved of that idea, about a 10-point delta. Now, this is just 2 years after Obama had won with a huge electoral mandate. And the most concerning thing here is about 1 in 4 Democrats actually wanted to see this healthcare legislation overturned, and 52% of independents, in an 18-point difference, 52 to 34, 52% of independents say, I want to overturn and repeal the Affordable Care Act. It was these messaging points that the Republican Party campaigned on in 2010 that eventually led to a massive, massive uptick in Republican support nationwide. It was a new era in American politics. The Tea Party movement drove it. They primaried a number of Republicans, and they went for blood, not just for Republicans, as I just mentioned in the primary, but very obviously for Democrats. And in a way, it is fascinating to see that this type of polling is what foreshadowed, eventually, the Democratic Party's loss, catastrophic loss in 2010. It was a key and primary piece of legislation that was seen by the White House, the Obama White House, as one of the most important accomplishments of their time in office, but also something that the American public did not take super well. But what's interesting is that it was just 49% of Americans that wanted to repeal this legislation. The approval rating on it was closer to 39%, as this disapprove number would show, approval rating on the Affordable Care Act in general. But it reminds me a lot of what we're seeing here. The share of Americans who oppose the bill, in some cases more than those who oppose the Affordable Care Act. And looking at that midterm election, this is the House map in 2008. Democrats at 257 seats, Republicans at 178. Just take a look at what Obamacare did to Congress. Democrats with a massive, massive majority. Just 2 years later, a whole lot more red on that map. Republicans gained 63 seats in the House of Representatives. And you might think, well, if the Affordable Care Act wasn't as unpopular as the One Big Beautiful Bill is today, it certainly must have been Obama. It couldn't have just been healthcare. And yes, obviously, there were factors beyond that. Turnout plummeted nationwide, and a number of other things contributed to it. But again, asking why, well, voters didn't necessarily despise Obama at this point. In fact, Obama's approval rating was about 45%. Disapproval rating, 50%. About a negative 5-point net between where it was in the disapprove and the approve right before the midterm elections. Still resulted in Republicans gaining significant amounts in the House of Representatives. And that's fascinating because what we know, at least now, is that if a president is unpopular, you can reasonably assume they would lose similar numbers to Obama. But that hasn't in fact been the case given the recent election results. And what we know in 2026 is that Trump probably won't be losing 63 seats in the House of Representatives, but it does speak to a point that in 2022, the Democrats didn't necessarily have primary pieces of legislation that were seen like Obamacare, but obviously had some very substantive ones. But it wasn't enough for Republicans to paint out a huge boogeyman, especially in the day and age of the Dobbs decision that completely reshaped the electorate months before the election. But in 2026, what we're seeing with this huge bill that Donald Trump steamrolled through Congress is that voters don't like it. And because the effects haven't been felt yet, the approval rating on it should be higher than before the bill passes. Voters should look at it and say, I think that this is going to, be something that maybe works for me. Because it isn't an overhaul of healthcare that would make people point out and say, I'm going to lose my doctor. The One Big Beautiful Bill in very many ways has been trying to be positioned and marketed by the White House, by the Republican Party, as all positive for the American public. And it isn't to say that Obamacare didn't try the same thing. But voters weren't buying it in 2010, and they're not buying it in 2025. The primary difference I think we will see is that similar to Trump's first round of tax cuts in 2017, is that voters won't eventually warm up to this idea of what the bill that Donald Trump is passing. I do think that eventually they'll really sour on it in a way that voters did not sour on Obamacare. It ended up being way more approved of today than it was at the time of passage. But I don't think that's going to be the case with this bill. And I think it's going to provide Democrats the continued opportunity to really message against Republicans in a good way for them electorally. Because what we are seeing is that even before voters can feel the impact, voters don't like the bill. And if voters don't like the bill and passing it through late night hours and having a number of concessions for some of the most extreme members of the House Republican Conference, you're going to find that voters are not going to like that. And many of the voters that voted in 2024 will also be impacted by this. Whether they voted for Harris or they voted for Trump, the outcome will likely be the same for them because it doesn't matter who you voted for. This legislation impacts a lot of America. And a lot of Republican districts and a lot of Republican voters could very well see access to Medicaid revoked. Could very well see their employment status have to change if they want to continue being on government subsidies, or potentially the age difference here. I mean, what we're going to find is that there's a lot of differences that are going to be made in these people's daily lives. And that's a huge thing. We've already started to see that with this, decision, the passing of the bill, we've already started to see hospitals close across the country in rural towns and areas that rely on this government funding that are now getting their benefits cut by the federal government. I mean, at every point, there will be impacts. And so while it may not result in Democrats gaining 63 seats like Republicans did in 2010, there will be a felt impact. And electorally, it will be felt by the GOP. It is massively unpopular. That is correct. And the way that Democrats have been messaging around it has continued to make it massively unpopular. And so I'd be interested to see what happens between now and the 2026 midterms as to how this big, beautiful bill finds its way interwoven and intertwined within Democratic messaging and how they try to win back the House majority in 2026. Because given how narrow it is today, it would just take a handful of seats, quite literally an entire handful, 5 seats, Democrats have the majority. And chances are, given recent electoral trends, Democrats will get a much more significant majority, potentially that rivaling of what they got in 2018. So keep an eye out. We'll see how this is something that Democrats talk about, how voters react to it, how they feel the direct impact, because it's a big bill. It's sweeping for a reason and is going to be quite impactful. And so definitely something to watch, definitely something to see how Americans approve and disapprove, because I imagine over time it could only get less popular. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.